This war has stretched the generation gap so wide that it threatens to pull the country apart. Kristin Hanna, The Women. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski, and today we're reviewing the source of that quote, The Women by Kristin Hanna. It's a historical fiction set during the Vietnam War, and it follows a young army nurse's metamorphosis after serving in the war. It's a book that has a lot to say about the America of the 60s and 70s and the unimaginable cost of the war, but more than anything, the untold story of the women that served in Vietnam, and there were over 250,000 of them. We're reviewing this one with Ramya Amathan, of course, and our guest, our regular contributor, Sara Hillis. How's it going, guys?
Great. Cool.
Good book.
Yeah, we'll start right there. This was a good book.
Solid.
Sarah, you're the one that recommended this one. Where do you want to start with this?
I will start with why I recommended it, and that's just because I read this title for a year and a half or something, however long it's been out. And I was like, what is this book about the women? Like, what is this? It didn't sort of twig me at all. And then I read the synopsis finally. I went, oh. And I've always been very interested in the tensions and the interesting time that was the Vietnam War and the sadness and the horrible stuff that happened. And I thought, well, okay, Kristin Hanna, I haven't read any of her books before, but I know she tends to take bits of history and kind of make fiction that describes them. So I thought I would check this one out. And I really do. It really was a very good book. There are times when you're just almost on the floor in a ball, kind of going, oh my gosh, how could people live through this stuff? Like,
anxiety inducing.
I did find it very moving as well. This is what I'm not easy to move with a book, and this one definitely did it for me. What about you, Rams? Opening remarks?
Yeah, and I was going to follow up and ask you what specifically made it moving for you, because for me it was the descriptions. Just so many vivid descriptions from the beginning to the end of this book, whatever the scenario may be, whether it be a party or a war scene or a tragedy of some sort during the actual Vietnam War, or the flying of a helicopter, whatever it is, it really put me there. Whether it was pre-war, during, or post-war, back in society again. And whether it was inside the protagonist's head, like her thoughts, her flashbacks, her traumas, or the actual environment and things that were going on and people's reactions in society. I think the description was just absolutely excellent and meaningful.
Descriptions told from a first-person perspective, in this case the main character, Frankie McGrath, who's a young army nurse that's being deployed to Vietnam. And from the very beginning, there was so much opposition of her even going there. And that was just the nature of the times, but especially like the neighborhood and the place that she came from in the country, this very like country club-esque, very military adjacent community in California on an island, and just very conservative. And it was a challenging read in a lot of places because it was frustrating from this first person perspective of Frankie wanting to get the same recognition that her brother got for going to war. It was honorable for her brother, but it was dishonorable for her to go. It was extremely unfair, and that type of dynamic happened over and over and over. And it sounds monotonous, but it hits you harder every single time.
Mm-hmm. Because she keeps pushing through. That's the friction, right? That, you know, we see and hear about the women don't go to war. There's no women in Vietnam. That's the line of the
Constantly.
book, right?
Yeah, there were no women in Vietnam. Like, even the veterans were saying that.
Exactly. And her experience is gaslit, if you will, from beginning to end. And
that's exactly what it was. It's a perfect example of gaslighting, actually.
Yeah, fully. Aside from obviously other women like her who've gone through it and everybody dealing with it in different phases, and the handful of people, usually women, but not necessarily, who are like, we get it. But other than that, the entire world gaslit you. And I think that's the purpose of the book.
To talk a little bit about the structure, very early on, she finds out that her brother dies in service in Vietnam. And to do her part for her country, she decides to enlist as an army nurse. And she goes there for, I think, a year and a half?
Yeah, about 2 years. Actually, she decides to do this before he dies.
Was it
That's
before?
the
Oh,
thing.
you're
it's
right.
like the day he died, the day they find out he's
absolutely. Yeah, that's
dead.
right. You're totally right.
Because a man told her that women can be in Vietnam as well. That
Yeah.
was
Women
very
can be heroes
interesting.
too.
Women can be heroes.
So she goes and she joins the Army Nurse Corps because it requires the smallest amount of training. The other two, Navy and Air Force, say you have to be stateside for like 2 years before they'll send you into the combat area, which is probably actually quite prudent of them. But but she wanted to get there really soon because she wanted to see her brother again. There was a whole bunch of motivations for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and then like the day she made the decision, or it might have been a couple days, but anyways, it was around her birthday time, I think, too. And this policeman or this army military person came to the door, Navy officer came to the door and gave them the horrible news, right?
Yeah.
And then she's like, "What am I doing? Like,
Yeah.
I'm doing this, but what am I doing it for?"
And at the point that she gets that news of her brother's death in Vietnam, it's already too late for her to back out. Like, she's already on her way to Vietnam. So it's like, what horrible timing. She was expecting to see him while she was there. But she spends, at least probably the first half of the book is spent in Vietnam. And the second half is her return back to the country. And it's turbulent, to say the least. Do you want to touch on the second half a little bit, Rams?
The second half, to me, we've said this about other books, but it felt like a completely different. I think we said this specifically about Patriot, huh? By Alexei
completely
Navalny.
different book.
Right. It felt like you needed to be in a separate headspace. It was like part 2 of the journey. It was tough. A lot of the PTSD explored, obviously, the post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of the ups and downs of Frances particularly was jarring. Like, it was jarring to get on board with as a listener. And I think that was obviously the point, right? Like, she couldn't hold it together and neither could I. There was a lot of unraveling of realities, especially when it came to her romance life and people who thought these are all spoilers, right? Like, are we okay to spoil? People who we thought were dead from war who weren't, and coming back to life, literally.
Well,
that's what it felt like. and all of us discovering together, like, what? Which is huge, right? Like, we got people, this was interesting to me. We had people who were dying and the shock of news of people dying and then getting used to that was one side of the coin. And then the other side, which was portrayed a lot in the second half of the book, which is people who you thought were dead coming back and then learning about prisoners of war in that scenario. And just like a lot of unknown voices and faces coming back to life. And that was jarring in a whole other sense.
Another part I thought was really jarring in this book, The Women by Kristin Hanna, was she spends the first half of the book as an army nurse in Vietnam, seeing all sorts of death, just working for 12, 14, 16 hours in basically a combat zone, treating people with horrible wounds, just operating in horrible conditions. Traumatic, to say the least. When she gets back home, the first thing she does, like the day she gets back, she goes to a country club dinner with her mom where you have to follow all the etiquette. And that scene only works if you've read the entire first half of the book. And it's jarring, and it doesn't even need to be said that it's weird. You just experience the strangeness. One of my favorite parts of that book was like the first day of her coming back.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, how do you think Kristin did writing, like, the reality of what it's like to live with PTSD and flashbacks?
I think she did a really great job. She had a lot of source material. As if you read the book, you'll see her acknowledgments at the end. She spoke to people. She journalistically researched what it was like.
So well researched.
I think this is her strong suit in most of her books, from what I can tell. And so the way the dreams worked, the way that having nightmares affects your actual physical responses. Like you end up on the floor, for example, when you're in the bed, or you like there's stories of men or like combat soldiers waking up and almost strangling their wife or something because they're still in their dream, right? And Frankie doesn't do those things, but she does. Like it acts out in your entire body, right?
Exactly.
And I think Kristin did a great job of exploring that and showing it to people, and showing how no matter how much you tell anyone, if they don't buy into it, they're not going to buy into it.
For real. That was a struggle through and through for the characters, just to get her parents to understand that she was there. She was in Vietnam. Like, her dad made up some lie that she was doing extended education or something, right? Like, where did she go live? I can't remember.
Florence or something?
Yeah, to Italy. Yeah, that's right. Her dad was so embarrassed of having his daughter go to war that he lied to everyone in the country club, saying that she was not in Vietnam. She was actually studying in Florence.
Which stems from his own generational trauma, right? He himself couldn't serve in war. This huge identity crisis that comes from living in America and serving your country. And as a man, these are your responsibilities. He didn't. He couldn't. And then his son goes to war and dies almost immediately. And then his daughter pretends like this is a thing that women do and goes to war. I mean, he's just dealing with so much in and of itself. Do you think that was explored enough, Jacob?
I liked the dynamic between her mom and her dad as well, because I think there was an understanding, at least from the reader's point of view, that they were extremely old-fashioned, and they were both, as you say, kind of the result of their own generational trauma. And her mom, she was extremely ladylike and followed all the the etiquette that you're supposed to have
with the
when
help
you're
of
like
drug and alcohol.
Yes, with tons of drugs, which is actually super representative of the 60s. It was like a horrible pill popping culture in like their mid 60s.
Mommy's Little
like,
Helpers.
Yeah, Mommy's Little Helpers was super popular. What were they, those Mommy's Little Helpers, by the way? It was
Usually
Valium, right?
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Just to give that
Or other
to
barbiturates,
hysterical women.
Yeah. No, I think that was great. I think that in The Women by Kristin Hanna, we have a mom who's got this really, really rich person mentality, and a dad who is kind of self-made. And so he doesn't want to mess with his reputation because he knows his reputation is kind of on the knife edge.
Obnoxious.
Right.
Wait, what's obnoxious? The way that he handles everything? Or
both her parents' attitude. Frankie, the main character in this book, had to fight it constantly to try to have a conversation to talk about it. And it said this in this book. I thought it was so good that her parents came from a generation where talking wasn't really part of their fabric.
No talking.
They were people who were meant to be optimistic with their chin up, and you go to work, and talking is like what weak people do, and it's not part of their generation. And it is something that her parents as characters, they develop, and by the end they're ready to talk. And spoiler alert, that's kind of how the book ends.
Yeah. The thing is, like, there's so much shame, right? There's so much underlying shame. Every character we get to know to some degree is experiencing shame on a very deep level. The father and mother we already talked about. Frances, of course, in her own shame, especially coming back from Vietnam and then feeling like she can't live with the choices that she's made. Then there's all this other stuff going around with her identity because she's in love with a man who who's not hers. Right? Like, he's married and has kids, or a kid, whatever. But through the whole book before that, she is very self-righteous and doesn't want to have any, quote, affairs while she's in Vietnam with men just because they're available, just because they're far away from their reality and lives back at home. Men who are trying to be with her but have their own wives and kids waiting at
and
home.
she doesn't follow up on that.
She doesn't do it well, but she preaches it. She preaches
Frank
it
is
in
a
the
very
beginning.
flawed character.
She is.
She's
Which
very
is believable. It
idealistic
is.
and naive, and to consider how
She's
young
a
she was
kid.
going into Vietnam,
Yeah.
super understandable. The average age of the casualty in Vietnam was 23 years old.
And she was, I think, 21 when she went in.
When
She was
yeah.
21.
When she was
and
enlisted,
you can
yeah.
understand why being that young, immature in a place where no amount of maturity can help you handle it mentally. You can understand why she came back broken the way she did. And it's not just the war, it's also the love affairs that she has through this book during the war and when she came back to America. And there were 3 relationships throughout this book. It's a decently long book too. Sarah, do you want to talk about those romantic
Talk about
endeavors
the
that she
romance,
gets into?
Sarah.
Yeah, tell us about the romance. Let's get romantic.
So I'm going to just begin by saying when I first read that she was a rich kid, I was like, oh, darn it. Must it always be rich kids? It annoyed me. It was only later when I realized that was a real obstacle for her.
Yeah.
That I was like,
That
okay,
was legit,
okay,
yeah.
I'll take that. So the romances, there's a couple, there's a doctor and a pilot, and then there's a psychiatrist guy actually that's later in the book after. And so Henry, yes. And so they're all terribly good looking, really, in their own little ways, which is like, okay, generic convention, I suppose. All right, fine. But I'm just like, oh man. And like the doctor was this suave kind of guy. He's like, you're safe. It's okay. I got you. And he was being sincere in the moment because there was a rocket attack going on or something. So, I mean, it's fine. But there was this whole, it felt a little soap opera like in parts, right? Like it always came back down to earth. It was always real enough. But there were just these moments where I was just like, okay, we're having a girl guy romantic thing because that's what every novel has to have nowadays or something. Like it was my
Was
own.
it that? Was it that every novel has to have that, or was it that she was so naive? She was, she grew up in this ladylike society where, like, you don't date, you don't do this, you don't do that, you get married, and you give yourself to the one. But she didn't get to live all that. Like, all of that was shattered going into Vietnam. So now she's a full-grown woman going into war.
I mean, I think that these things actually did happen. I'm not saying that they didn't happen, but the way it was structured in the novel felt less real and a little more soap opera like. I can't describe it.
I know what you're saying. It felt like a little parenthesis of soap opera here and there. That said, it made sense to me for her character that she would fall in love 3 times. Actually, probably 2.
No.
And then like fake love for the 3rd one. Because in being in such a terrible place, like in the middle of the jungle in Vietnam mid-war, it's understandable that you would look for any kind of connection, kind of comfort. And that's what she would fall for people who are honestly like Rye and Jamie, the 2 soldiers, the pilot and the doctor. They're not very likable as people, and I'd even go as far as to say a little bit underdeveloped, but it kind of plays into her naivete that she's willing to fall in love with anybody who hits on her because she doesn't really reject anyone. As soon as they advance on her, like she kind of goes for it, just with those 2.
Well, she does have some inner struggles with it, I suppose. But it's just the way it struck me. Like, again, I think the motivations are all there. I think it's proper for her character to have done it in the sense of character motivation, but somehow just the way it was written or something. I don't know.
Did you roll your eyes?
I did. Well, if I could roll my eyes, I can't. But yeah, I kind of went, oh God, okay. Good looking guy. Yeah, okay. But maybe that's just me and I'm being unfair.
I don't know. I just do think that she was startled into adulthood. Like that's the only way that I can think about it. But you still have these girlish or young, naive, juvenile desires, right? Like that's an actual struggle, yeah. But because we had to grow up so quick, we all did with this book. It comes through. It comes through that she falls for someone so heavy. And remember, oh man, this really struck me later on when I was reading near the end of the book that this guy Rye, he's really screwed her up from the beginning. Because if you think about it, he's the one who told her that women can be heroes. He's the one who sent her off to war, if you will, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so that fire was lit from the beginning. And if you will, like, you know, he's the one she should blame for all of it. That's the way I thought about it in a very simplistic viewpoint.
And yeah, she comes through it and starts to admit her part in all these things too, which is good, which is character development, right?
Yeah.
So
it's character development, and there was a lot of that, you know, minus what you're saying, Jacob, about other characters who weren't so explored. But I do think, like, part of this book, or part of my experience of reading this book, is to understand how, like, people aren't ready. Nobody was ready. All the men, the women, remember that scene when she was getting on the flight for the first time with her neatly pressed clothes and her brand new overnight bag.
And you knew it was going to be just
and those gorgeous shoes or whatever she had on that her mom. I mean, like that Band-Aid was ripped so quick. She barely had to land in Vietnam. But everyone in that plane, people were new and shiny. The soldiers, the gestures, like the hand gestures, the formalities, all of it felt fresh and new and exciting.
They were the FNGs.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. The FNGs, the FN new guys.
Yeah. Right. But it was like, that was completely shaken immediately. And then you got to see through her journey, through Frances and Ethel and Barb's journeys, see them take on other new kids coming into the block, and then see how America politically was reacting throughout this whole thing. Like, war's great, war's fantastic, help us out, we're winning, to maybe not.
To Walter Cronkite on the news openly saying, I thought we were winning this war. What the hell is going on?
Right.
And I think it was Frankie at one point describes that she has this epiphany that she never lived on her own. She goes directly from her parents' big house in South California to a hutch in Vietnam with nothing in between. That was her moving out on her own.
That's wild.
And just a quick narration note, because we should talk about that. I mean, it's Julia Whalen, so I have not much to say other than awesome, awesome, awesome job, because she always does an awesome job. But she did a great job of, I think she actually helped us see the characters, even if they weren't fully developed in the writing. I think for me, she helped me feel who Barb was and Ethel was. And
I loved those girls.
Yeah.
Cool.
Can we talk about those girls?
Killers.
They were unrealistically good friends that somehow every time Frankie had an issue back when she was in the US, these two would pay tons of money to fly over and go and see her. In the 60s.
I don't get
like,
flying on planes.
On 4 different occasions. Both of them just dropped everything for this one girl. And
they
Frankie
picked up collect calls.
Yo, honestly, that.
Do you remember this girl with 3 quarters got in a 2-minute call?
She had a stack of quarters. Do you know how much quarters are worth back in the late 60s? It's ridiculous.
But I do want to say that, I mean, if you're in a situation like that, things like that do happen. Maybe not to the frequency, but if you're bonded with a unit like that, I think things happen like that more often than we might think.
So it is realistic.
They're not just girlfriends; they're fellow, veterans and soldiers, and it's weird for me to think about them having the money to do it and leaving kids behind and all that kind of stuff, just running out to California. But when they took her in Virginia, that was pretty neat. I like that.
Yeah, that was a nice phase for their friendship and for her growth as well.
But can I just say that the relationship between Frankie and Barb and Ethel, which were 2 other nurses that she spent her time with in Vietnam, it seemed like a bit of a one-way relationship where Frankie did all the receiving.
Yeah.
Because it seemed like Frankie was never giving any emotional support to these other two. They seem to be
Yeah,
doing pretty well. Like they just gave and gave and gave, and she took and
But
took
their
and took.
emotional intelligence was incredible.
Yes.
They were a little more like types. Like Ethel was the apple pie kind of woman that went and lived her life apple pie,
An apple pie
kids and
type.
everything. An apple pie type. And Barb was the revolutionary radical, right? These are the two types of women you can have. Not
what was
only
Frances?
the two, but yeah.
What was Frances? What was her type?
She was nothing. She was a lot of things.
She was everything.
She was a lot of things. I mean, it's her point of view. So necessarily the characters are not going to be fully developed because they're not focused on.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
This book's final chapter happens at the unveiling of the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. And this had me going into a rabbit hole into what this monument actually was, because that was the best chapter of this book, in my opinion, because it put every part that came before it into context, into what it meant, not just for Frankie and Barb and Ethel, but every American. And if you go and read testimonials of what that war memorial means to Vietnam vets nowadays, it's one of the most powerful memorials you'll ever see. If you go, it's basically two gigantic walls of granite that are arranged kind of in a V shape. And as you go down towards it, you're literally surrounded in these two huge walls that are engraved with the 58,000 names of the people that died in Vietnam. And the granite is slightly reflective, and so you can see yourself back. And it's an incredibly moving memorial. And it made me realize that this type of thing, this monument, this memorial that's meant to bring you back to a time so that you can remember it respectfully and not forget the lessons that should be learned from this type of conflict, are incredibly valuable. And that's why there's over 5 million people that visit that memorial every year.
Wow.
And somebody that should visit it is Donald Trump, because he's taken this world into a place that's scarier and scarier. And you should know that war is the last thing that we want. Go and look at those 58,000 names and tell me that you want to proceed with the war, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for that PSA. That was worth the whole episode.
Sarah, it was super worth reading this book. I'm really glad you gave us this recommendation. Seriously, this was really good start to 2025.
Yeah.
Best book I've read in January so far. You're the best. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks.
And Ramya, you too. Have a good one.
You too.
That's it for today's AMI audio book review. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe to our video. Leave us a comment if you want. If you're listening to the podcasts, you can send the podcast page to your friends and also follow us if you'd like. I'm Jacob Shemansky. Have a good one.